그럼 오늘 5번째 이 무대를 꾸며주실 연사분을 소개해드리겠습니다. Lufthansa Innovation Hub의 Managing Partner이신 크리스틴 웽 님께서 The Travel and Mobility Tech Landscape and Future of Travel이라는 주제로 강연을 해주시겠습니다. It's a great privilege to introduce Kristen Wang, Managing Partner of Lufthansa Innovation Hub, will talk about the travel and mobility tech landscape and future of the travel. Please welcome her with a warm round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today to talk about the travel and mobility landscape. I'm actually really glad to be here today in person. I think in a time where traveling has been almost at halt for 1.5 years, it's really a privilege to be here today. And I want to talk about 3 things today and share with you. The first is I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem around travel and mobility and how we actually define the sector. And I want to talk about the role of Asia in it as well. The second thing I would like to share with you is also a little bit on what we do at Lufthansa Innovation Hub. And last but not least, I would like to share a little bit around what we believe will be the trends of the future of travel. So let me start with a little bit the landscape. So actually, over the last decade, we've seen quite a lot of changes within the travel and mobility sector. And we can see that getting from A to B has been changing tremendously. And for the longest time, we've actually seen the travel chain as very isolated segments within the journey. So from an accommodation to a flight, to a car rental, it were these very isolated and separate transactions. But actually, we think of the travel chain as something more seamless, more connected. And we see this as more of a infinite loop of travel. Why is that? It's because nowadays we have so many more digital touch points. The customer, the traveler, the passenger actually can step out of their house, take a mobility service such as a Kakao taxi, an Uber, can then go to the airport, take a plane, but at the same time already book the next flight, the next trip. So actually, the travel chain has become much more seamless, much more connected, much more digital. And we see this, that there's a new breed of stakeholders actually driving this radical change in the industry. Now, we don't only talk about offline travel agencies anymore. We don't talk about travel tours or any other operators that just kind of have the interface to the users. We actually see quite a lot of different kinds of players now actively talking to the travelers and the passengers, from startups engaging with them, academia, VCs, tech giants, accelerators. And those players all have are engaging actually with the traveler along that travel journey. And that's also the reason why we at the Lufthansa Innovation Hub not only talk about the travel chain, but actually the travel and mobility tech chain, because it's all now interconnected. Now, when we think about innovation in the industry, we always love to track deal funding. We love to see how many startups are actually getting into the space. We look at VC funding, VC deals, and I can tell you that the innovation dynamics actually has been quite accelerating. So this is just giving you a little bit of a capture of like what has happened over the last decade. So you can see that 2012, 2013, this is really the start of this industry or the sector that we call travel mobility tech. And you can see that it actually accelerated from 2014 to 2018. And you see a massive growth actually coming mostly from the ride-hailing industry, where a lot of funding has flown into that sector. But also if you look at 2019 and especially 2020 when we had the pandemic, even then you see that the levels of funding has still been quite high. So we're currently at 26 billion that 2020 has seen in terms of VC funding flowing into startups within the travel and mobility sector. And also, I think what is very interesting to see is that in general, by end of 2020, we actually see 49 unicorns within the whole space around the globe. And about $240 billion has already been flown into these travel and mobility tech unicorns. And I think what is also very interesting is to see the role of Asia within that ecosystem. So here's another chart that I want to share with you. This is, again, the funding levels from 2012 to 2020. But in this case, we not only see the absolute numbers, but we see the percentage share of different regions. And as you can see, China and Southeast Asia in particular have actually gained traction. And since 2015, has almost seen more than 50% of all funding going into the region. And now that's, of course, curious and very interesting to understand why this is the case. And if we look a little bit closer at the landscape of the unicorns, you can see that some of these unicorns actually came to rise in the last 3-4 years. And we can see that a lot of the adoption has been accelerated within the region, much faster than maybe in the West. And you can also see that also due to more flexible regulations that we have in Asia, it's much easier for those startups to grow. Now, of course, you may ask, how is it looking like in 2021? Well, I can tell you that in 2021, we actually see a consolidation now. We see a lot of unicorns exiting, and they're exiting through a new vehicle called SPAC that you may have heard of, which is essentially the merger of a startup with a shell company that is already listed. And so a lot of companies are actually now going public, going to get more funding from the public markets. For example, Airbnb with an IPO, or Zonder, or also Traveloka has actually announced going public with a SPAC, which is also very interesting currently within the startup scene. Just to give you some more numbers, so in terms of where the fundings are going in terms of regional look, China actually still dominates in Asia. So even in 2020, 6 billion were flown into Chinese startups within the travel and mobility sector. And that actually represents a 27% share of global VC funding. And as of 2020, end of 2020, there were 11 Chinese unicorns in the travel and mobility tech sector, mostly also, again, within the mobility space rather than the travel space. But also what I think is very interesting is that we also see a little bit of a shift from Chinese startups gaining traction to Indian and Southeast Asian startups. And you can tell that VCs are actually pouring more and more money into the Southeast Asian markets and India, so comprising of 2 billion in 2020, or a 10% share of the global VC funding. That is, of course, in part of the trade war that you, of course, see within the Chinese and the US markets, and also tightened regulations within China, where it's harder and harder for VC money to actually be deployed within the Chinese markets. So investors actually have now looked for new opportunities, which they have found in Southeast Asia and India. Now, of course, it's quite interesting to see that a lot of funding has been poured into the mobility space. Now, what about the travel and especially the aviation space? Well, for one thing, I can tell you, when I joined the company and I was at a conference, what I thought was really remarkable was someone was telling me that there are actually only 26 booking classes when you buy a ticket. Why is that? Well, it's because the IT landscape is so old, it's actually from the 70s, that the system to actually process tickets cannot take more than one letter from the alphabet, and there are 26 letters. Hence, that is the reason why even revenue management is done with 26 prices. And so my point here being, aviation has always been a very safe space, and it's really, really hard to enter as a startup. Some of the other reasons for why this is the case is, of course, you have regulatory constraints. In general, of course, the whole sector has been quite risk averse, as it is natural, since safety and security is such a big point for the aviation industry. And as I mentioned before, legacy IT has always been a bit of a difficulty to overcome. But what I think is also quite interesting now with the pandemic is that we see quite an openness now from the airline industry to actually change, to actually adopt more digital, more transformational systems in order to be more agile and being able to react much faster to these changes within the ecosystem. But what we also see is that there are startups that are starting to disrupt the aviation space as well. This is just an example. Hopper, it's a startup from Canada. They actually built an AI-based predictive analytics tool that helps to predict prices, flight prices for consumers. We actually do have a stake in Hopper as well, because we believe that this is really driving a new kind of travel future and revenue management. Another example that I brought with me today is Kiwi.com, which is essentially doing virtual interlining. Virtual interlining is connecting different flights, different airline companies, as well as different routes together for the passenger. So this way, the passenger actually has more routes to access and to book than each and every airline can actually provide. So also this one is quite disruptive to a network planning that traditional airlines actually deploy. Now, because of that, because the aviation industry is of course very tightened, and because we don't see a lot of startups innovating, this is sort of like also the reason why we exist. We are the interconnector and also the glue between the Lufthansa Group and the broader travel and mobility tech ecosystem. And what we do is we translate not only the trends in the market for the Lufthansa Group, but also we invest, we build companies, and we do strategic partnerships with startups within the ecosystem together with the Lufthansa Group. So our mission is really to create and capture value beyond flying, and really to be complementary to the aviation industry and to the aviation group. So next to new business and building and investing into ventures within the travel and mobility tech space, we also help to scale the potential of the group by bringing in agile methodology as well as like collaborative new methods to the group. And we also publish reports through our thought leadership arm. For example, the funding tracking that I just showed you actually came from the thought leadership team. And we are a global company. So we have our headquarters in Berlin, but we also have an office in Singapore and in Shanghai. And as I was highlighting earlier, in terms of the Asian market and the Asia role, this is also the reason why we have 2 offices within the Asian markets, simply because we believe that digital behaviors and maturity is so much more advanced here versus the West. Some of the examples, just to illustrate a little bit what we did in the past. So TNMT is our research platform, our market intelligence platform, where we not only track VC funding or innovative startups within the space, but also you will read about innovative technologies within the space, for example, air taxis, and we publish insights and reports on it. We also spin out startups. So Rides was a startup that we spun out 3 months ago, and it's one app for mobility, and it allows employees of companies to access different types of mobility, for example, scooters or public services, and then you can actually offset all these different trips within the company. Offset API is another example that we're currently spinning out. It's a company that actually allows and enables CO2 neutral travel and logistic chains by building products that are green together. And another example around more innovative pricing mechanisms. So this is a 10-pass flight pass, which allows you as a passenger to travel, and essentially as you get the coffee, the 11th coffee for free, this is kind of the same mechanism of paying less for 10 flights. So now, of course, this is just a capture of like the current state. Now, of course, with the pandemic, with the crisis, the question really lingers, what is the future of travel tomorrow going to be? And today, I did not bring any figures around COVID. I did not bring any figures around demand, because I think one thing that we learned over the last 1.5 years is that it is really incredibly hard to predict the future at this point in time because of mutations. And I don't have to tell you, of course, about the travel restrictions that we are all exposed to. I don't have to tell you about quarantine measures, or in general, I think the pent-up demand that we all feel. Like if we could, we would all travel today. So therefore, what I brought today is I want to give you a bit of a bet on what we believe are the trends for the future. We believe they are here to stay. The first is the empowered consumer of tomorrow. Actually, we see that more and more people want to be more flexible in their booking. More than 40% that we've actually surveyed said that they want to be booking less in advance and more ad hoc, and depending on the situation, book a destination of their choice. We also see that, for example, on Airbnb, the searches for very interesting or unique experiences have actually increased by 1,700%. So, for example, living in a tent or on a special boat, for example, are some of the keyword searches that we've seen. And it really speaks to the consumer that really wants to take things into their own hand and to really make the experience more personalized. We also believe that virtualization of human interaction will be here to stay. I mean, this, for example, this conference is also hybrid, right? So a lot of people are also watching this from home. And we also see this in the VC funding radar. So for example, virtual collaboration tools as well as virtual event space tools have gotten a 1 billion increase in VC funding. And it really is something that is likely to stay here, because as companies are trying to figure a way out of how to bring their employees back to their offices. We also believe that there's a switch from transactional to relational. At the beginning, I was already saying that more and more people are thinking about seamless experiences across the entire travel chain. And we actually believe that this switch from transactional to relational will stay and is accelerated through the pandemic. So for example, subscription models, 90% of new travelers will be the Generation Z, and they all have subscriptions. But also if we look at China, for example, live streaming has become this one touch point where consumers can actually relate much, much closer with KOLs and influencers that are traveling through different destinations. So also here we see, for example, on TikTok, 80 billion has been made in social commerce simply through live streaming and giving people the access to visit places and destinations virtually. We also believe in the digital side of sustainability. That's actually a trend that is very much prominent in Germany, for example, but also in the wider Europe, where, of course, a lot of people are now researching new technologies to make planes more sustainable. But at the time, or for the next 2 or 3 years, we're still asset constrained, meaning the asset base will only slowly change. So for that reason, we believe that the digital part of sustainability, so making things more transparent, making your CO2 footprint more apparent, and also offsetting some of that CO2 is going to be a trend to stay for the next 3 years. Last but not least, we believe that reinstallation of trust in air travel is something that will stay in a short term. So a lot of airlines now thinking about self-service kind of methods. They emphasize on hygiene, but also here to go a little bit further, we believe that especially more more interesting mechanisms such as air taxis and EV VTOLs will actually dominate the future of travel. So I want to tell you as sort of like my last takeaway from this is that actually I believe that with the pandemic, and yes, there are a lot of losses coming in the sector. I mean, I think there were about $500 billion lost just in the industry through the pandemic and COVID. But I actually believe that this is also a major opportunity for disruption and for innovation, because now we actually have this kind of opportunity, the mindset to change. And so this is really an encouragement for any startups out here to really think about these 5 trends and also think about what opportunities there are to capture. So with this, thank you so much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inspiring us and encouraging us. Thank you. So we will have a Q&A session. So anyone who has a questions, would you please raise your hand? 네, 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 질문이 있으신 분은 손을 들어서 질문을 해 주시면 됩니다. 진행상 저희가 질문은 영어로 받도록 하겠습니다. 네, 앞쪽에 계신 남성분께 마이크를 가져다 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. And I just want to know about the aviation sector. For example, during the pandemics, as you have mentioned about the digital sustainability, right? And I want to know I want to know about the Asian airlines or the European airlines. Do they prepare for the do they change with the digital transformation, any digital things as they have developed or so far? I want to know about that one.
You were talking about sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, a lot of airlines are now investing into sustainable aviation fuel, which is a recycled kind of oil that actually goes back into the system. And because of that, it is actually CO2 neutral. So a lot of airlines are now starting to invest into that as AF, but also into other technologies such as hydrogen or electronics. But of course, the cycle of research will take a little bit of time, which is the reason why digitization is currently the only trend that we see that's really sustaining over the next couple of months and years.
혹시 추가 질문이 더 있으실까요? 네, 감사합니다. 또 다른 분 질문 있으신 분께 저희가 마이크를 가져다 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 그러면 질문이 없으신 걸로 알고 이번 세션을 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 루프탄자 이노베이션 헙 메이징 파트너이신 크리스틴 웽 님께 여러분 다시 한번 박수 부탁드립니다.